It is my pleasure to introduce Shobhana Xavier, or Xavier, yes, I'm sorry, an associate professor of religion and diaspora from Queen's University, which I checked is next to Lake Ontario. She works on Islam and Sufism in the United States, Canada, and Sri Lanka, as well as on popular spirituality, which is, as we know, it's popular is always just spirituality is a very much debated expression, but she said she is going to go a bit into this popular spirituality topic in her lecture. So we will hear more about this. She explores the development and practices of contemporary Sufism, that mystical dimension of Islam, looking at it through the lens of migration, diaspora, gender, popular culture, rituals, spaces, and institutions. He is the author of 3 books. One is The Dervishes of the North, Rumi, Whirling and the Making of Sufism in Canada, published by Toronto Press. So I'm hoping we will see Mevlevis together in Nuremberg. This is the first monographic study on Sufism in Canada. She is also the author of the book Sacred Spaces and Transnational Networks in American Sufism. Baba Muhayyadin and Contemporary Shrine Cultures, published by Bloomsbury Press. And Baba Muhayyadin, sorry, I'm sure I mispronounced that. So Baba Muhayyadin Fellowship is one of North America's major Sufi movements. It actually originates in Sri Lanka, but has become a more global phenomenon. And it seems very interesting, especially because it's a vegetarian Sufi Brotherhood, which for those people who work with Islam, they would know that it's very unusual. That's very exciting. And it was also one of the first to establish a Sufi shrine in Northern America, if I understand correctly. She's as well the co-author of the book Contemporary Sufism, Piety, Politics, and Popular Culture by Routledge. So they are very fertile. And she's the co-editor of Sufism in Canada, Weaving Islamic Practice and Contemporary Spirituality, published by University of British Columbia. Her next project on which she's working here at Erlangen, it takes her back to Sri Lanka, where she is researching Sufi shrines in a social environment where there is a growing anti-Sufi sentiment, which is also a global phenomenon in Islam, and where at the same time there is an ongoing religious, ethnic, and political tension on the island, on Sri Lanka. So it is in this environment she wants to study Sufi shrines. She is interestingly also trained as a primary school teacher and has taught kindergarten, not only in Canada and England, but also in Sri Lanka. And she also co-hosts, now this is very modern for me, 2 podcasts, New Books in Islamic Studies and Just Eats. I think New Books in Islamic Studies speaks for itself, but Just Eats is very interesting. I checked, and it's stories of food, identity, resistance. So please.
You blessed the stage with water, so that's great. Thank you. Thank you for the thorough introduction. What I'm going to do today is talk a little bit about the Baba Muhayyadin Fellowship that you introduced, and then also a little bit about my work in Sri Lanka, which I'm working on right now, or at least coding data. I want to situate perhaps the thing that weaves my intellectual curiosity and scholarly work, which is essentially this question of the definition of the challenges of defining Sufism. And I think at CAS-E, there's been a general tendency to think about challenges of labels across the different work and fields and areas and religious traditions or spiritual traditions that everybody's focusing on, and what the work that labeling actually does. Sometimes it's racially coded, sometimes it's coded in other ways. And this is actually what I do with Sufism, at least my approach to Sufism. So I would say that, at least from my starting point, they're both an internal challenge and an external challenge. internally, there's just the basic challenge of defining Sufism, and this is a challenge of translation. So tasawwuf in Arabic is actually a verb, which is a process of becoming, right? And so even in the introduction and generally in most scholarship, what you see Sufism translated into English is mysticism, esoteric practice, contemplation, spirituality, all of these dimensions that are coming from a starting point of Islam or the Prophet Muhammad. This idea of trying to figure out the definition or the translation of tasawwuf into English remains kind of a scholarly debate in Islamic studies, partly because it's how do you contain the spectrum of practices. So the spectrum of practices includes points of influence such as Neoplatonic thought, Hermeticism, ritual practices, shrine cultures, genealogies of teachers, right? So there's quite a bit of diversity in it. And so this becomes kind of an internal conversation that happens, and also conversation about what is Sufism's relationship to Islam, which I'll get to in a little bit. The other kind of reality is, and this is partly because I'm located in an English-speaking North American context, is the actual genesis of the study of Sufism within European and North American academy, namely in kind of an English, French, German context. And this is partly with Orientalism. So during point of contact with British colonization and what we would conceive of as the Middle East, South Asia, there was, of course, deep exoticization of a lot of religious traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism, anything that was obviously the East or the Orient, right? There was also a tendency to bifurcate and separate Islam as something that was dry, legalistic, and a tradition that was tied deeply to the Prophet Muhammad, who was kind of the worst example, like the antithesis of what a prophet should be, right? Jesus Christ being the pinnacle of what the ideal prophet is, as celibate, monastic kind of figure, whereas Muhammad is perceived as somebody who is warrior-like, multiple wives, and all of this kind of goes back to this moment of the Crusades and encounter of Christians and Muslims, right? And so in colonial contact, one of the realities is that some of these stereotypes are further exaggerated and invested in. And so Sufis, or wandering dervishes, or dervish figures, became figures that were really of interest. These were very similarly of interest to kind of yogis. And so what started to happen with a lot of folks who were writing travel logs, who were musicians, who were who were appointed, let's say the British East India Company, they became really interested in these figures, but also started separating Sufis as something that was different from Islam. Right? So Sufis are these figures who are mendicants, where Islam then is this thing that is dry, literal, legalistic. So a great example of this could be kind of the influence of Persian poetry has in both European Romantic tradition and also in American Transcendentalist movement, where a lot of poets, we may not necessarily classify them as Sufi, but coming from specifically a Persian tradition. And this is important because Persian and not Arabic, right? The Quran was written in Arabic and not Persian, right? So Persian poetry becomes the thing that is alluring and non-Islamic, becomes a way in which general ideas about Sufism gets permeated into European and American culture. And this permeation then informs lots of kind of transformations. Ralph Waldo Emerson, for instance, is really deeply enthused by Goethe's translation of Hafez, and this informs some of the transcendentalist approaches to spirituality. And in fact, they overlap, right? This idea of a universal soul, experience of the divine as something that's deeply internal, right? So the emergence kind of the academic studies of Sufism is also coming from this kind of genealogical tradition where Sufism is being received as really a universal tradition and perhaps just has some peripheral connections to Islam, partly because of this kind of colonial contact. And a lot of scholars have written about this. I think Catherine Albanese's Metaphysical Religion is a great example where she traces the specifically American context, but Eric Schmidt is another example where people are kind of mapping the ways in which different metaphysical traditions, esoteric traditions, spiritual traditions are being received and transformed into new religious movements, specifically, I guess, from where I'm located in a North American context. So what does this mean for me as a scholar? What this means is that I'm bridging kind of two different fields, interdisciplinarities. One is that I'm often speaking to an Islamic studies audience, which there's some of you in this room today. And the conversations with an Islamic studies audience is really about the relationship of Sufism to Islam. Some of these are really deeply theological questions. For instance, going to shrines, and I'll show you a lot of pictures of shrines today. Does going to shrines and venerating holy people that are interred there challenging the deep monotheism of Islam, which says that there's no God but God, la ilaha illallah. This is the fundamental tenet of Islam before you are testing that the Prophet Muhammad is the Prophet of Allah, right? So is going to this shrine practices, is it blasphemous? And part of this also gets entangled with this notion to reform Islam during post-colonial moments when modernization is really developing and people want to modernize, westernize, all these different broader trends that are taking place. Sufism and a lot of other minoritized religious kind of sectarian traditions like Shia Islam become presented as these backwards, superstitious, magical, localized practices that are not reflective of an intellectual, textual tradition that is Islam. So Shia Islam, Sufism, shrine visitations, these kind of esoteric dimensions that have been deeply part of Islam are seen as un-Islamic. So I'm speaking to that audience. And then I'm also speaking to this audience, which today I'm calling popular spirituality, which Esther mentioned. This audience changes a lot. I think this could be sociologists of religions, people who are interested in new religious movements, those who are looking at secret cultures, spirituality generally, those who are interested in Western esotericism. This name changes, and I think people in this room are really invested in the ways in which this name changes, so I don't have to do too much explaining there. Sufism becomes framed within these communities. Some are consumer communities, some are communities that are really invested in practices as non-Islamic, but universal. It's accessible. It just so happened that Sufis had translated themselves into Arabic and went through Islam at one point. But before that, Sufism existed because it is a universal tradition. It's committed ultimately to union with the divine, which a lot of religious traditions believe. And in fact, some people believe that Sufism's origin is in Hinduism. Right? So there's kind of a lot of these states. And so because there is a translatability about some of the core philosophical and spiritual ideas of Sufism, then Sufism is really appealing to a lot of the secret cultures. And so these two kind of worlds is where my research is embedded in, and I'm trying to have conversations between them. I will say I'm not ultimately invested in pinning down a name. I am more interested in the capacious possibility of the work that Sufi is doing. Right? What does it mean to be Sufi? And this is where me being an ethnographer comes into play, because I'm trying to see how people are telling me, my interlocutors are telling me what Sufism is. So it's the limitations and possibilities of labels that I'm interested, and not so much the labeling itself. Some of you might think that that's cheating and I'm copying out, but that's kind of where I've arrived at in terms of the particular state of the field at the moment. This Venn diagram is a diagram that I often go back to. There was a Sufi teacher named Simi Ghazi who I worked with, and she's a whirling dervish and a sheikha, a female teacher in Vancouver. And during an interview with her, I asked her about the relationship between Islam and Sufism. And she said one of her teachers, Winston Cornell, had shared this with her in an introduction to Islam class. And this is something that she continues to think about, is what is the relationship between Islam and Sufism? Is it a relationship of overlaps? Is it a relationship where Islam is the bigger circle and Sufism is the essence? Or is Sufism the bigger circle and Islam is the essence? And she said yes, yes, and yes to all three. So she's also cheating by not giving me an answer. And so this is kind of the complexity that I want to bring into the work that I'm doing. And I'm bringing in namely by focusing on the field ultimately. So I hope that gives you a sense of the work. And I am building upon the work of scholars like Mark Sedgwick, Alexander Knish, Anne-Marie Schimmel, huge shout out to her. And I'm hoping to add to some of those conversations. But at the end of the day, I'm not a historian. I am definitely an ethnographer, and the rest of the presentation will give you some case studies of things that I've worked on that really challenges kind of my grappling with this idea of Sufism and what my interlocutors have to say. So the first one, which was my doctoral dissertation, was on the Sufi teacher, Bawa Muhyiddin. And at the time, to give you a sense of what the field was like about 10 years ago, there wasn't a lot of writings on it. There were some writings on Western Sufism, and a lot of it was tied to kind of esoteric practices, whirling dervishes, which is a popular kind of a practice that, in Germany was a big deal, Western Europe, United States also, and now Canada. But Baba Muhyiddin became, at the time, kind of fixed as the ultimate example of Sufism in the United States. But what was interesting that is everybody had a different definition of it. Some people said that it was a new religious movement. Some people said that it was a diasporic Muslim movement. Some people said that it was a cult. And so scholars like Marcia Hermanson, Gisela Webb were writing about it. But at the time, Sufism in the United States wasn't really an established field, but everybody had lots of thoughts about who this guy was and what his community was. So for my dissertation, I spent a lot of time just trying to answer this very simple question: what is the Baba Muhyiddin Fellowship? That was my dissertation project. And the answer, unfortunately, is not super simple. So this took me to trying to map out and understand a little bit of Sufism in North America. And I hope in some of the examples I'm going to share, it gives you a sense of how we label is doing certain work and the type of erasures that it's introducing into some of the lived realities of folks. One of the first things I realized in doing this research is that often folks are starting to study Sufism in the United States from the 1960s, let's say, and I'll get to that in a bit. But the reality is Islam came to the United States before the United States was the United States. And in fact, some of the first Muslims or enslaved Africans who were brought from the west coast of Africa. And scholarship to this date by Carl Ernst and a lot of other scholars doing amazing archival work have documented that some of these enslaved Africans were practice Sufism. So when we do kind of frame Sufism as predominantly a new religious movement or even a diasporic movement, here's an example of an erasure of Black experience of Sufism in the North American context. And this is really, really important because a lot of these narratives are what's informing some of the Black-based Muslim organizations that are developing, like Nation of Islam with Malcolm X. And so it's really easy to kind of frame these as Black power movements and not actually movements that have some ties to Islam specifically. And also that a lot of these movements have deeply esoteric connections that are not read into Western esotericism because the label of it being a Black-based movement overrides it as being politically hyper-politicized in terms of Blackness and not the fact that they're practicing Arabic numerology or mystical letters, right? And Omar ibn Said is a great example. He had his autobiography has been saved and has been now translated. And there's really interesting incantations that are in it, which sometimes we might read as magical incantations today. They're talismanic, right? And so here in the framing of even just moving back the story we tell of Sufism in North America helps us think about the ways in which mysticism could have unfolded for different communities in different ways. And I think Omar ibn Said is a really, really important example in the North American context. The other kind of starting point of Sufism in the United States is usually with Hazrat Inayat Khan. Hazrat Inayat Khan was a musician from India, and he came to the United States in the early 20th century by ship from Gujarat with his cousin brothers, and they came under the idea of being performing music. And so you see them here. And so what they did was they would go to different shows presenting. And this was a time in which theosophical societies, these kind of ideas of esotericism was really deeply well known amongst a particular elite in the United States. And so these were kind of some of his targeted audiences, right? And so when he's going to do these shows, he would meet people who were interested in him, and then he would privately start kind of teaching them. And so some of the first students that he had in the early 20th century were individuals who were themselves spiritually curious and experimenting with the different ideas, transcendentalism, Theosophical Society being a main one. And what's interesting is that when he translates Sufism to them, he doesn't necessarily translate it in the language of Islam. He tries, but they were Islamophobic, as one rightly is. When he came to Ellis Island and got off, the porter asked, "How many wives do you have?" So we're talking about legitimately a time when anti-Muslim sentiment and Islamophobia is real. So in his effort to translate Sufism, which he understood as a Muslim to be Islamic mysticism, his main audiences were non-Muslims and therefore had some stereotypes about Muslims. And so he had to translate Sufism as a universal tradition. And he writes in his biographies that he did try to incorporate prayers and things like that. But his students were not interested in that stuff, right? That wasn't the atmosphere, that wasn't the milieu into which he was coming into. So he himself had to do some translation work in order to make the truth that he felt was important accessible to his audience. After 1960s, this is a period in which we start thinking about Sufism. So this is a moment in the 1960s and what was often referred to as the counterculture era, where there's sentiments about anti-war with what's happening in Vietnam, civil rights movements. And there's a lot of folks who are spiritually curious, who are leaving synagogues and churches, experimenting on drugs, psychedelics, Woodstock, and all of this stuff. So you have Buddhist teachers, Hindu teachers. And within this climate, within this milieu, is when Sufi teachers are also part of the circuit. So it does make sense of why we think of Sufism, kind of part of this broader popular, which I'm calling popular spirituality, but American spirituality that's emerging. And so at this point, we have teachers who are first, second, I would say now third generation from that era, right? So Zia Inayat Khan, pointer does not work, but Zia Inayat Khan is the grandson of Hazrat Inayat Khan, who came, right? And so we're talking about individuals who have now continued the tradition. We have somebody in the audience who is a member, Suleiman Loris, his son Jalaluddin was her teacher, and so who also passed 2 years ago. So we're talking about people who came to these movements in various ways, often though not particularly through Islam, but understood Sufism as a universal experience, right? So this then brought me to understand Baba Muhaiddin within this longer historical tradition. One of the things I did was also do an institutional ethnography. And one of the great things about the Baba Muhaiddin Fellowship is that it started in Sri Lanka and not in the United States, which allowed me to do more comparative analysis to make a case of whether Sufism in the United States is actually novel? Is it different? Is it unique? Which is what everybody said. What was happening in the United States with Sufism is different than what's happening in Sufism everywhere else. I disagree, but I also had to give evidence for that, why I thought so. So I mapped out the spaces in the North American context, and another instance in which also the demographics of the community changed. When Baba Muhaiddin came, he was actually brought by a yoga group who supported his visa application. And most of the individuals who were there were individuals who were mainly Black because it was in Philadelphia. He came to Philadelphia in the 1970s. And just near St. Joseph's University, right? And so they had bought a house, which is a synagogue, which they transformed into a community center, which now has a mosque. Initially, many of the followers were folks who were Black and who came from the Nation of Islam and Moorish Science Temple. In the mid-70s and later on, there was more of an influx of individuals who were coming from groups like the Hare Krishna community, Buddhist practitioners, and there developed racial tension. And so this is a moment in which many people who were Black did end up leaving, though some did remain as core members. The president was Black, for instance. And in the 1990s onward, what happened, it was quite fascinating, is that Baba Muhaiddin died in 1986. He initially was just interred in a property 50 acres westward out of Philadelphia in a place called Coatesville, which Paul knows because you've talked about. And this is a purely Mennonite Amish farm country area. So you have to imagine that you're going through rolling hills, horses and buggies, and all of a sudden you find a place that looks intentionally like the Taj Mahal with a dead Sufi guy from Sri Lanka. Right? This was just a community place, just a memorial for immediate disciples who wanted to do something to honor their teacher, because a relationship between a Sufi disciple, a student, and the teacher is very, very important. What they did not expect is that a Sufi shrine means something to a lot of Muslims around the world. And a Sufi shrine in America, where a lot of Muslims are, as diasporic Muslims, means more because it means they don't have to get on a plane to do a pilgrimage. They could get in a car, drive from New Jersey, and just have a great day at pilgrimage. And they soon found out that this was a porous place because Baba Muhaiddin apparently was a real deal. If you have problems with having pregnancies, you go there, say a prayer, your wish is granted, apparently. There's well water there that's really holy. People have reported dreams, mystical experiences of Baba Muhaiddin of just sitting at the shrine, right? So over time, now you go on the death anniversary of Baba Muhaiddin, which is the Urs, which is a very important day. It's understood in Sufism as the wedding day because this is the day that you have reunited with your beloved, that you have craved for all in this mundane life. You'll see hundreds and hundreds of people mainly Muslims who have never met him. But what they do know is that the Sufi shrine means something. And what's really fascinating about this is that the gatekeepers are these folks who were spiritual seekers from the 60s and 70s who didn't really understand what they did. They didn't know that when you built this mausoleum, that it meant something. So what I did is that I spent a lot of time trying to understand the interaction. Some of it was tenuous. People wanted to bring food and music and rose water. The disciples of Baba Muhammad, the white disciples, were very Protestant in their outlook and did not want any of that in the space. So a lot of the Muslims would come and tell me this feels like very clean space, because when you go to Sufi shrines in South Asia, it's very common for it to be loud, there's markets and all of these things. So there is an Americanization of a Sufi shrine in the American context. But it's now one of the premier Sufi shrines in the United States. And I think it gives you a sense of what's happening in many ways. In Sri Lanka, Bawa had a community in Colombo. These were mainly intellectuals who were more philosophically inclined. And in the north, where Bawa did start out his organization, most of his followers were Hindu. And one of the things that made Bawa really famous in northern Sri Lanka was that he was known for his exorcisms. A lot of people would come from very far, either for some kind of healing capacity or exorcisms. The story was from a lot of the people that he never did this in America because it scared Americans. But he would do them in Sri Lanka in the north, and it involved beating the demon or the possessed person and capturing the spirit in a jar and going to the beach and burying it in the sand, ultimately. So there's a beach somewhere in Sri Lanka with a lot of jars of possessed spirits, apparently. But this is how, as you're going from space to space, I start realizing different dimensions of one singular figure that everybody's trying to label in these multiple ways. And none of them are sufficient enough is ultimately the point that I'm trying to make. In Sri Lanka, he also had built a mosque. This mosque was dedicated to the Virgin Mary, who's very important in Islam. But Americans understood Virgin Mary in relationship to Catholicism and got really kind of weirded out by it. And so there is no sense of any Marian devotion in the American sense, but in Sri Lanka, it's kind of well known that in Sufism, the feminine, the Islamic mystical feminine is really important, and Mary represents an essence of that. So you could see some things that are translating and some things that are ultimately not. When I did my fieldwork in 2013 at this place, there was a memorial, like a tomb. It's empty, there was nothing there, but it was just believed that it was for Mary. When I went in 2018, that tomb was gone. And a lot of this was reflecting internal dynamics that was taking place within the community in Sri Lanka over what is appropriate Sufi practice. And so I'll come back to this image in a second because this is what's defining my work at the moment. But to conclude, some of what I've said about the fellowship is that in my fieldwork, I've found immense amount of diversity. If you want to talk about racial and ethnic diversity, we could frame it in that way. There's moments and times there were Black Muslim present, South Asian Arabs. So if you want to talk about it religiously, Muslims, non-Muslims, people who are Jewish, Buddhist, Christians, everybody. You could frame whatever. A Jufi is a name that you often hear of somebody who's Jewish and a Sufi, right? They're very proud of that. So what is the fellowship? Naming it purely as a new religious movement or Islamic movement or Muslim diasporic movement is not possible. It doesn't really reflect all the different variations I saw. So this is me kind of unsettling what labels do and the limitations of it, and why it's important to really get into the nitty-gritty and be okay with being messy, because this was something important that I found in my fieldwork. Baba Muhammad and his community in the north is ultimately what brought me to Sri Lanka, and particularly this moment. Encountering this kind of what I have labeled in my work as ethnographic grief. What does it mean to show up to a field work where there was a shrine, and then imagining how my entire project and my life's work could have been different if I showed up 5 years later? It was something that really got to me, and it's something that I'm really processing. So where I finished what I thought I had gathered was contemporary modern data as an ethnographer in 2013. I've gone back to the same site and I'm dealing with loss and trying to pick up from there. And that's what's informing the rest of my present work, which is Sufism in Sri Lankan context. So because of this ethnographic moment of loss, what I've been doing since 2013 and then subsequently all of the years after is that I've been mapping Sufi shrines in the Sri Lankan context. Sri Lanka is a complicated place, partly because there was a civil war that ended in 2009. The civil war was an ethno-religious one. There are Sinhalese majority on the island, about 70%, and many of them are Buddhist. And then there are minorities, Tamils, Hindus, and Muslims who are an ethnic identity. So to be a Muslim in Sri Lanka is an ethnic identity, even though you speak Tamil. So there's a lot of ethnic, linguistic identity politics in the Sri Lankan context. The civil war was really one of the Sri Lankan state against the Tamils who wanted a separate state. But Muslims got caught in all of this. All this to say that part of what's happening in Sri Lanka post-war, which technically ended in 2009, but as we know, any place that has gone through civil war for a long time, the residue of war is ongoing in terms of how people pick up and move on, and truth-telling and reconciliation and all of that that's going on. So we're talking about a place in which graves from the war are still being found, right? And there's still a lot of things that are happening at the United Nations, a lot of kind of things around memorialization and memory. So the idea that there's unmarked graves in a political landscape of civil war and my interest in dead bodies of Sufi saints, there's an overlap there that I'm trying to think through and work through. And I would appreciate any feedback or direction on work around that. So there's a lot of land politics, but there's also not a lot memorialization of minority communities like Muslim communities. And so because of this, one of the things that I've started doing, because I've been mapping Sufi shrines so much, is thinking about Sufi shrines themselves as archives. What does it mean to think of Sufi shrines as archives, especially when one of the things I've done for my research is go to all the different archival places that I could. So the British Library, anywhere that I think British administrators would have been in Sri Lanka, would have been writing about Sri Lanka. I'm just trying to see if I could actually find archival documentation of some of these Sufi shrines. And this is also problematic because I think the archives has some authority over the lived reality that I'm trying to document. But this is kind of the work that I'm trying to undo even within myself, is to say, oh, I've documented all these Sufi shrines, but I'm going to these archives and none of those Sufi shrines are there. So does that absence of official archive mean that the Sufi shrines I'm documenting are not really legitimate, not really real? They're not authentic enough or historically valid enough? So you could see kind of the methodological conundrum that I'm in. So in dealing with absence in official archives, but abundance in the landscape, I'm trying to think about what these stories do mean if I take them to be true. And some of these stories are fabulous stories. And I mean fabulous in not fabulous aesthetically, but fabulous in awe-inspiring stories that we're talking about giants and time traveling and disappearing into thin air. So can these be legitimate stories in themselves? And can they then be archives of Sufism on an island where documenting minority rights is quite complicated? So you could see some of the political realities that I'm working with. So I'm thinking a lot about memorialization and memory. And thinking also about across the Indian Ocean. Some of these stories are stories you'll find in South India or in Singapore and Penang in Malaysia. And so I think that is also quite interesting. And some of these stories, as kind of Esther had mentioned in the introduction, are also stories that are being revised in the contemporary moment of reformism in Islam, where theological debates about what constitutes Sufism is very legitimate. Are Sufi shrines legitimate or not? Are they heretical spaces? Are they blasphemous spaces? These are really, really real. So some of the anti-Sufi sentiments could be coming from a state level, but some are also coming from within the Muslim community. So it's intra and intra as well, right? So one example of a fabulous story is Daftar Jilani, which is a site that's associated with Abdul Qadir Jilani. He's a 12th century Baghdadi scholar. There's popular tradition about him that he's wandering for 12 years. If you go to the coast of South India, there's a lot of Sufi shrines dedicated to him. And in Sri Lanka, there's a site dedicated to him. Why would he come to Sri Lanka? Well, of course, Sri Lanka is a place where Adam, when he was expelled from heaven, landed to. There's lots of stories in the 8th and 9th century of Arab scholars who wrote of Serendip, Sri Lanka. Historically, Adam apparently fell to Hind, India. But over time, over the centuries, you get a specified location that Adam felt to Adam's Peak, which is the name of the place, in Sri Lanka. There's a giant footprint at the top, huge. I'll come back to the giant footprint in a second. So, of course, Sufis from all over the place used to come. Ibn Battuta's travelogues is a great example. He has an entire chapter on Serendip when he gets shipwrecked and he goes up to do a pilgrimage to Adam's Peak. So because of this, there's a lot of Sufis historically holy folks, teachers, Muslims generally, who would come and stop over. So this is the rationale that Abdul Qadir Jilani came to Sri Lanka to go on a pilgrimage to Adam's Peak. It's 5,000 steps up. It took me 4 hours to get up and another 4 hours down. My legs are done the next day, to say the least. After he did that, he went on top of a hermitage site and he hung out for 12 years repeatedly. When he decided he was done, he went into his cave, he held out his hand, and he disappeared to Mecca, because that's all you do. You're miraculous, you're special, you could time travel, and you could you don't need airplanes. So not that he's actually entombed there, but the memory that he traveled from the small island to Mecca is what is memorialized there in a cave, very tiny cave. I've been there, I'm very claustrophobic, was not a fun experience. And so people over time have come to this place. The problem in Sri Lanka and a lot of places in South Asia and the Middle East to some capacity is a lot of people have different stories of a singular place. So Dr. Jilani, also known as Kurugala, is complicated partly because the Buddhists believe that this was a Buddhist monastery before it was a Sufi shrine. So I've been going to this place since 2013. When I was there in 2013, the army was actually there destroying the place, so it was quite dangerous for me. And I went back in 2023, and you could see the difference from the entrance with the marble lion on the one side, and this was the entrance before. So this is a place that the state has claimed as, in terms of to celebrate the victory of the war. And so claimed it back as like a Buddhist-Sinhala space. The Muslims are there, but a lot of the Sufi shrines, the smaller shrines that have developed over time, were destroyed. And so this is one reality of some of the shrine spaces. The other one was Adam being a giant. There's a lot of fun hadith tradition that say historically the prophets were really, really big people. And because human beings were morally regressive, we became short, right? So we're short, but originally they were 40 feet long. One of the things you'll find in Sri Lanka are really long tombs, and they're specifically known as 40 feet long tombs. You'll find some of these in South Asia and Pakistan, and you'll also find some of these in places in the Middle East. And this is why in a lot of times you'll see giant footprints. So Adam's Peak on the top of the mountain, there's a giant footprint on the mountain, and it's believed to be Adam's. Of course, the Buddhists believe that it's Buddha's footprint, right? But the point is that it's a massive footprint, right? An entire shrine that's built around it. So when you start seeing giant tombs all around the island, you start realizing that there is a cosmological significance, that these are technically descendants of the prophets, and because they're long people, that they've been built over time. Now, again, I'm not necessarily suggesting that these are real. And in fact, some people who I go to these shrines would say, well, this possibly can't be real. But what I am interested in is the work that it's doing, the story that it's doing, that the memory idea of this, when it was perhaps real at some time, is doing, is that it actually cosmologically locates Sri Lanka within kind of a Muslim universe. And I've told you multiple stories and just to explain the fact of these long tombs, right? These are stories that I'm not necessarily finding in the archives, but these are stories that a lot of the interlocutors and people who hang out at these shrines are telling me very easily, right? And so this is kind of some of the ways that I want to bring this out in the Sri Lankan context. The other one is the perennial prophet Xavier. Xavier is really, really important in Sufism. He's often connected with a lot of different religious traditions, St. George, Elias, Elijah. He's often told a lot of stories about him with Alexander the Great, where they find kind of where they're going on conquest and things like this. So he's a perennial prophet, which that means that he is living forever, and he kind of comes and goes in cycles ultimately. And so in Sri Lanka, Xavier becomes a really, really important figure in a place called Katragama. And in Katragama, there's a place for Xavier. Interestingly, this place is also shared with Murugan, a Hindu god, and Xavier and Murugan could be interchangeable, and it's not a problem for anybody, right? And so this is a site where people go for healing. And what is believed by most folks is that every 7 years, Xavier comes to this place on a cyclical basis. And this is, again, a signal that these people are not dead, but perhaps live on a different temporality, a temporality that human beings can access by coming to that place. There's a story of Xavier in the Quran as an unnamed figure where he travels with Moses, and they're going to seek the water of life. And so there's a fountain that is called the water of life at the Katragama. I don't actually think it's the water of life. I've never drank it before, but it is a well that is there. And it is a place, again, signaling to some of these stories that have come all the way across the Indian Ocean to Sri Lanka, where people might generally say, we did not know that one, Islam existed, and two, that Sufism is really deeply rooted in the land in the way that it is. You'll find a lot of legs, wooden legs, because people have come here for healing. And once healing is successful, parents usually come back with toys and things like that of a replica of the thing that has been healed, and they leave it in the mosque. And there's also a healing stone in a separate room where you're supposed to hold on to it, which my colleague is doing. And if you hold on to it intentionally, healing is promised. And usually a lot of people come here for poison. So if you get bit by snakes, one of the popular thing to do is go to Sufi shrine and hold either a stone or the tombstone. And it's believed that usually the Sufi saint can help. So these are kind of these popular narratives that means there's usage across religious communities and ethnic communities. I've been in Katragama and had Buddhist monks in orange robe come and stand there and pray in front of a tomb, which for me is even destabilizing, because you think of the ethnic division in the country and the religious division, you think that this is not possible. But there is a fluidity in which people are moving that even as I think academics, we are too attached to the labels that we give some of these spaces. And of course, for me, a lot of my work is also interested in gender, and a lot of the Sufi shrines, some of the Sufi shrines I found are to Sufi women. Again, these are things that you wouldn't find people writing about. Some of these stories are often unnamed. The Nachia saint, which is a stone rock that you see in the water, she was apparently being chased by assaulters, and she ran into a cave and yelled Allah's name, and a boulder came and fell. So the community and the neighborhood still believes that she lives in the caves, and she's not dead. Right? So a lot of the stories are really challenging notions of temporality, spatiality, and just a different timeline, which I think is really, really important. And I think if you take it seriously, it gives an important sense of time and space to communities that are minoritized and persecuted in a country. And I think this is how I kind of came to this notion of Sufi futurity. So this is something that I'm working on. And a lot of this is inspired by Muslim futurism and Islamic futurism, and a lot also from African, indigenous, queer futurist studies, where people are thinking about what does it mean to theorize and believe, construct a world from places of otherwise. Some of these are really kind of science fiction. The Nation of Islam is a great example that Elijah Muhammad, the teacher in the 30s and 40s, were theorizing on UFOs and motherships as places to have that the Earth, the United States, but the Earth generally could not offer the possibility of a future that was racially just. And so UFO and extraterrestrial life was what needed to come to take Black Muslims from the United States out, and the racial utopian possibilities existed otherwise, right? So there's lots of really cool, interesting work that's coming. A lot of it's from aesthetic, art scenes and things like that. So I've been reading a lot for pleasure, but I've also started thinking about how that could inform my work. And this is not to say that these are my interlocutors telling me this. This is me thinking, why is it that I'm not finding these stories in the archives? What are these rich, abundant stories that are really challenging a binary sense of temporality, spatiality, and all these amazing ways, and really magical? And not only that I'm documenting it, but what is it offering people that it's offering in otherwise worlds, right? It's not offering a world that is still militated by the state that doesn't give them right or recognition, but it's giving them possibilities of spaces where they can be real and access the divine in some ways. So this is what I'm playing with. I haven't fully figured it out. So this is just me sharing that with you and sense of where my work is at and where it's headed at the moment. So to conclude, I made sure to keep on the time limit here. So to conclude, the so what? So I would generally say, as an ethnographer, I've found lots of kind of access because of the method of studying lived realities. Sometimes it's even difficult where scholars say, well, is this even Sufism anymore? And I think that's such a great question, because I, again, am not really here to create compartmentalized labels and identities of what is what. But when people in the field tell me that this is what they understand, that's what I want to take and think with, right? And how are they using it, right? And this has brought me to spaces, movements, rituals, and the shift to thinking of archival and recuperative work is something something that is new for me and I'm really excited about. And for example, because it's recuperating stories of Sufi women that historically are not documented. And if they're not in the archives, it doesn't mean that they don't exist. There's other ways to find those stories, the stories of Sufi saints. They're apparently living in caves forever, right? Geographically, I've been really interested in flows, both across multiple oceans. But earlier, my work was really invested across the Atlantic Ocean, and now I'm thinking across the Indian Ocean. And I just love the idea of the ocean giving me the possibility of movement and mobilities. And so that doesn't restrict me as much, but I'm trying to see where the waves take me. And ultimately, for me, the things that I have found people say Sufism is religion, it's spirituality, it's Islam, it's non-Islamic. And I found them in the moments of in between, in the flows, in the shifts, in the unknowns. And the in-between space, the barzakh, is really important in Islam. So the in-between, the no space is kind of an excellent theoretical possibility. So I will leave it there and happy to just have a conversation with everybody. Thank you so much.